Well, hello again. I am John, and we are reading Cultural Anthropology, asking questions about humanity. Chapter 1, Anthropology, asking questions about humanity. Human beings are one of the world's most adaptable animals. Evolutionary history has endowed our species with certain common physical characteristics, instincts, and practices that have helped us to survive, even thrive, in every conceivable terrestrial environment. Yet no group of people is exactly like another. And as a species, we exhibit tremendous variations across groups. Variations in our adaptations to the environment, physical appearance, language, beliefs, and social organization. Humans have always encountered groups of people who look different, speak peculiar languages, and behave in unexpected or unpredictable ways. Although sometimes hostility and wars break out between groups because of such differences, usually people have found ways to get along, often through trade and alliances. To be effective at establishing strong social and political bonds in spite of human differences has always required that people have a practical understanding of human variation. Some of history's great travelers and explorers developed that practical understanding. Among them, the Venetian Marco Polo, 1254 to 1324, the Norman cleric Gerald of Wales, the Franciscan missionary William Rubrick, the North African Muslim Ibn Battuta, and the Chinese Admiral Xing He. These individuals were all deeply interested in other peoples, and their writings express sophisticated understandings of how and why the groups they encountered looked, acted, worshipped, and spoke as they did. Similarly, there is a rich historical legacy of intellectual thought about human variation. The great Chinese philosopher Confucius wrote in two of his Analects some principles for establishing relationships with Yi, meaning cultural and ethnic outsiders. A generation later, the Greek historian Herodotus, in his 7-volume histories, described the diverse peoples and societies he encountered during his travels in Africa, Southwestern Asia, and India, offering a number of possible explanations for the variations he observed across groups. While all these individuals were curious about other peoples and at times quite rigorous in their ways of thinking about human variation, they were not anthropologists as we think of anthropology today. They were not researchers asking systematic questions about humanity, and anthropology as a discipline did not emerge from their writings. Still, their various studies show that getting along with people from different cultures has always been important, a point that is sometimes lost on us in the United States, where our international prominence and our preoccupation with American exceptionalism may lead us to think that we don't need to understand people and cultures from other countries. But if we Americans want to be most successful in dealing with people internationally in politics, trade, treaties, and global environmental or health policies, we need to understand in systematic ways the people from other countries and the cultures that guide and motivate them. These points lead us to our first question, the question at the heart of this chapter: what is anthropology? And how is it relevant in today's world? Embedded in this broader question are the following problems, along with which this chapter is organized. Anthropology is a study of human beings, their biology, their prehistory and histories, and their changing languages, cultures, and social institutions. Anthropology provides a framework for asking questions about and grasping the complexity of human experience, both past and present. Anthropology is about where humans have been, but it also provides knowledge that helps solve human problems today. How did anthropology begin? During the 19th century, anthropology emerged in Europe and North America as an academic discipline devoted to the systematic observation and analysis of human variation. It was made possible once intellectuals and scholars had developed rigorous ways of comparing different species and people with different cultures. The Enlightenment, or Age of Reason, which began in the early 1700s with the rise of modern science, demonstrated that careful observation and analysis could lead to understanding the natural world. Sir Isaac Newton explained the principles of physics and gravity. Geologists demonstrated that many species of animals, like the dinosaur and later enormous elephant-like creatures such as woolly mammoths and mastodons, had once lived on Earth, and biologists began to describe different species of plants, insects, birds, and mammals, grouping them into families and larger level groupings. But while scholars acknowledged differences among peoples living on the different continents, they did not attempt to explain these variations until their own societies had begun to change as a result of industrialization. Previously, cultural differences were assumed to be a given. Cultural variation in the 1800s was thought to be essentially as it always had been. But as intellectuals began to notice that their own societies were changing because of the rise of factories, they realized that other societies around the world had also been changing. Three key concerns began to emerge by the 1850s that would shape professional anthropology. These were: 1, the disruptions of industrialization in Europe and America; 2, the rise of evolutionary theories; and 3, the growing importance of Europe's far-flung colonies with large indigenous populations whose land, material wealth, and labor Europeans and Americans wanted to control. The disruptions of industrialization. Industrialization refers to the economic process of shifting from agricultural economy to a factory-based one. Industrialization disrupted America and European societies by bringing large numbers of rural people into towns and cities to work in factories. The rise of industrial towns and cities raised questions about how society was changing, including how a factory-based economy and the attendant growth of cities shaped society, government, residential patterns, and culture. These were the questions that motivated great social thinkers, in particular German political economist Karl Marx and Max Weber, and the French anthropologist, sociologist Emile Durkheim, each of whom influenced the rise of anthropology as a social scientific discipline. At the beginning of the 19th century, most people in Western countries were rural and were usually engaged in farming. Industrial inventions like the cotton gin, the steam engine, and factory machinery made it possible to produce goods in large numbers and quickly that used to be made slowly by hand. In the factories, workers did repetitive tasks for long hours to mass-produce goods. Factory economies affected such basic aspects of life as who individuals would marry, what activities they would spend their days doing, and the role of religion in their lives. In the midst of these social and economic upheavals, anthropology developed as a discipline that sought to understand and explain how people in rural and urban settings organize their communities and how they change. It also led these scholars to consider how industrialization affected peoples in European colonies in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Pacific Islands. Important new questions were posed. Why did these diverse societies organize their lives in the ways they did? Why did Native Americans and Africans not develop industrial societies as European societies had? Why had the civilizations of China, India, and the Arab world developed social, political, and economic patterns distinct from those of Europeans? And why had these other civilizations not experienced industrialization as Europeans had? Asking about how European villages and cities were structured and how they perpetrated their cultures ultimately led to questions about how all sorts of non-Western societies worked as well. The theory of evolution. A second key influence, A second key influence on the development of anthropology was the rise of evolutionary theory to explain biological variation between and within species. Evolution refers to the adaptive changes organisms make across generations. English naturalist Charles Darwin developed a theory of how different species of plants and animals had evolved from earlier forms. He based his idea on personal observations made during his travels with the British survey ship HMS Beagle, as well as his own backyard experiments raising pigeons, among other things. The key mechanism of his evolutionary theory was what he called natural selection, a process through which certain inheritable traits are passed along to offspring because they are better suited to the environment. Thus, in Darwin's view, in subtle ways, nature was sorting out or selecting those forms best adapted for the environment. Darwin had developed his theory of evolution in the late 1830s, but delayed publishing his findings. He knew that his theory would be controversial, and he feared a backlash from a conservative religious community and from more established scientists. The idea of biological evolution was a remarkable notion for people used to thinking of species as fixed and stable. Religious scholars interpreted the book of Genesis in an Old Testament to suggest that God had created all of the natural species once at a time at the time of creation, and that no new species had been created since then. For Darwin, however, the question of the origin of species was not a religious one, but an empirical one. It was a question that could be answered by observing whether species had changed and whether new species had emerged over time. From the findings of contemporary geologists, Darwin knew that many early species, as the dinosaurs, had arisen and died out. For him, such changes were evidence that the natural environment had selected some species for survival, and that extinction was the outcome for those not well suited to changing environments. When Darwin published his groundbreaking work on the origin of species in 1859, he experienced the backlash he feared. And few scientists accepted Darwin's ideas immediately. Indeed, as late as the 1920s, some biologists continued to be uncomfortable with the idea that species might change over time. But as the older generation left the scene, younger scientists recognized how easily this simple theory explained most kinds of biological variation, both within and between species. Today, biologists and anthropologists no longer view biological evolution as controversial, and nearly all anthropologists and biologists accept evolution as the only way to explain the relationship among animal and plant species, and the only way to explain why humans have the biological abilities and characteristics we can observe today. Since Darwin's time, the broader scientific community has borrowed from his theory to produce a wave of new ideas involving evolution. Evolution seems to provide a framework for studying both the biological and cultural development of humans and their societies. Among biological anthropologists, the inheritance of physiological traits allowed science to understand the history of human origins and our relationship to other primates. Among early cultural anthropologists, evolutionary models seemed ideal for explaining how different societies had come to be as they were when Europeans encountered them for the first time. The notion of evolution allowed early anthropologists to rank societies along the evolutionary scale, which they assumed showed which societies were more advanced because they had passed through more primitive forms of society with simpler technologies by adapting to their environments with more complex tools. Anthropologists today challenge such models of cultural evolution because this model does not fit the observed facts, but these early models motivated anthropologists to collect data from these so-called primitive societies before industrialization caused them to change or die out. Colonial origins of cultural anthropology. A third driving force behind anthropology was colonialism, the historical practice of more powerful countries claiming possession of less powerful ones. Although both China and Japan have had colonies, when we think about the development of anthropology, we usually think of colonialism as practiced by Europeans and Americans. We can think of American domination over Indian lands as a form of colonialism, particularly when government policies moved Native Americans from the southeastern states to what is now Oklahoma, largely because white settlers wanted their land. Overseas, the colonial period flourished from the 1870s until the 1970s, and whites established mines, fisheries, plantations, and other enterprises using local peoples as inexpensive labor. Colonies enriched the mother countries, often impoverishing the indigenous inhabitants. Colonial peoples everywhere had different cultures and customs, and their action often seemed baffling to white administrators, a fact that these officials chalked up to their seemingly primitive or savage nature. To understand how to govern such radically different peoples, Europeans and Americans began developing methods for studying those societies. Most Europeans and Americans expected their colonial subjects to die out, leading to the urgent collection of information about tribal societies before it was too late. Well into the 1920s, anthropologists pursued an approach known as the salvage paradigm, which held that it was important to observe indigenous ways of life, interview elders, and assemble collections of objects made and used by indigenous peoples, because this knowledge of traditional languages and customs would soon disappear. Of course, today we know that while some Indian tribes, especially along the East Coast, largely died out, many other groups have survived and grown in population. But these Native American cultures have had to adjust and adapt to the changing American landscape and all the changes that Americans of different national origins have brought to the continent. Anthropology as a global discipline. By the end of the 19th century, anthropology was already an international discipline. those practitioners were mainly based in Western Europe and the United States, although they had some shared concerns. Anthropologists, in particular, countries developed specific national traditions, studying distinct problems and developing their own style of thought. Throughout the 20th century, anthropology had begun to emerge in many other non-European countries as well. Many students in colonial territories had gone to European and American universities where they learned anthropology and in many cases brought anthropology back home. In these countries, anthropology often focuses on particular problems of national development and on documenting the minority societies found within the country's borders. Today, anthropology is a truly global discipline with practitioners in dozens of countries asking many different kinds of questions about humanity. What are the four subfields of anthropology and what do they share in common? Anthropology has traditionally been divided into four subfields: cultural anthropology, archaeology, biological anthropology, and linguistic anthropology. Cultural anthropology focuses on the social lives of living communities. Until the 1970s, most cultural anthropologists conducted research in non-Western communities, spending a year or two observing social life. We call this kind of research anthropological fieldwork. These anthropologists learned the local language and studied broad aspects of the community, recording information about people's economic transactions, religious rituals, political organizations, and families, seeking to understand how these distinct domains influence each other. In recent decades, they have come to focus on more specific issues in the communities they study, such as how and why religious conflicts occur, how environmental changes affect agricultural production, and how economic interactions create social inequalities. Today, anthropologists are as likely to focus on modern institutions, occupational groups, ethnic minorities, and the role of computer technology or advertising in their own cultures as they are on cultures outside of their own. Archaeology studies past cultures by excavating sites where people lived, worked, farmed, and conducted some of their activity. Some archaeologists study prehistory life before written records, trying to understand how people lived before they had domesticated plants and animals. Or they may construct the patterns of trade or warfare between ancient settlements. Two themes have been traditional concerns of prehistoric archaeology. One, the transition from hunting and gathering to agricultural, and two, the rise of cities and states when complex social, political, and economic institutions arose, along with occupational specializations, social class distinctions, and the emergence of early political forms that resemble states. Another branch of archaeology is historical archaeology, in which archaeologists excavate sites where written historical documentation about the sites also exists. The goal is to supplement what we know about a community or society from what is found in the ground with written records. Interestingly, historical archaeologists often find that few people actually lived as they described themselves in diaries and published accounts. For example, excavations on American cotton plantations have added a great deal to what we already know about the living conditions of slaves on plantations. Information that does not generally appear in written records because the lives of slaves and poor white farmers were rarely documented in more than cursory ways. Biological anthropology, also called physical anthropology, focuses on the biological aspects of the human species, past and present, along with those of our closest relatives and non-human primates, apes, monkeys, and related species. A mainstay of biological anthropology has been the attempt to uncover human fossils and reconstruct the pathways of human evolution. By the 1500s and 1600s, biological anthropologists expanded into the study of human health and disease and began to look at the non-human primates, especially monkeys and apes, to reveal what is part of our basic primate biology and what comes with culture. Biological anthropology is currently a field of many specializations. Researchers still explore human evolution, health and disease, and primate behavior, but they also work in areas such as human genetics, how social stress impacts the body, and human diet and nutrition. Linguistic anthropology studies how people communicate with one another through language, and how language use shapes group membership and identity. Linguistic anthropologists also look at how language helps people organize their cultural beliefs and ideologies. These anthropologists have traditionally studied the categories that indigenous people use in their own languages, attempting to understand how they classify parts of their social and natural worlds differently from people in other societies. Anthropology is by nature an interdisciplinary discipline. Its subfields cross into many other academic disciplines across the social and natural sciences. Cultural anthropologists, for example, often draw on social and psychological approaches as well as historical and economic data for some projects. Most archaeologists need to understand the principles of geology, including stratigraphy, the layers of earth in which human artifacts might be found, and techniques used to date artifacts. Many archaeologists also need to understand ecological and environmental sciences to be able to reconstruct ancient landscapes. Biological anthropology draws heavily on biological subfields of morphology, which deals with the form and structure of organisms, cellular biology, and genetics. One thing that keeps such diverse subfields together is a shared history. In the early 20th century, anthropology became organized into 4 subfields we know today. From a shared evolutionary perspective, archaeologists and cultural anthropologists, especially in North America, generally see themselves as asking similar kinds of questions about human cultures. The major difference is that cultural anthropologists can observe cultures as they are lived, while archaeologists can only reconstruct these cultures from what they have left behind. Another reason for persistence of the 4-field approach is that anthropologists have certain fundamental approaches and concepts they agree are important for making sense of humanity's complexity. These include culture, cultural relativism, diversity, change, and holism. And we will take a brief break. Culture. Imagine how people would react to you if the next time you went to the university bookstore to buy your textbooks, you tried to haggle at the cash register for them. Or if the next time you caught a cold, you explained to your friends that your sickness was caused by someone's jealousy, and this jealous person had hired a witch to cast a spell on you. In both cases, most people would think you are crazy. But in many societies throughout Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Pacific, In other regions, a lot of ordinary people would think you are crazy for not haggling or not explaining your misfortunes as the workings of a witch. Every human group has particular rules of behavior and a common set of explanations about how the world works. Within the community, these behaviors and explanations feel totally natural, which is to say, self-evident and necessary. People who behave differently are strange, wrong, maybe even evil. What feels natural to us may seem totally arbitrary to another group of people because the rules and explanations vary from one group to another. In anthropology, the term culture refers to these taken for granted notions, rules, moralities, and behaviors within a social group that feel natural and the way things should be. The idea of culture is one of anthropology's most important contributions to knowledge. It is also one of anthropology's oldest concepts. Its first use commonly credited to British anthropologist Edward Burnett Taylor in the 1870s. In Classical Contributions, E.B. Taylor and the Culture Concept, we examine his original definition of culture. Anthropologists believe that people have culture in two senses: the general and the particular. Culture, in the general sense, refers to humans' possession of a generalized capacity, even necessity to create, share, and pass on their understandings of things through culture. From this point of view, the development of culture is the defining feature of our species' evolutionary history, and thus great relevance to the subfield of biological anthropology. Culture, in the particular sense, refers to the fact that people live their lives within particular cultures or ways of life. For example, although the American way of life, quote, is actually culturally diverse, with differences across regions, social classes, and ethnic groups, most Americans share very similar beliefs about such things as the value of a formal education, what kinds of clothes women and men should wear to the office. I think it was a page music. Oh, and what side of the road to drive on. Archaeologists, linguistic anthropologists, and cultural anthropologists tend to study people's lives in the context of a particular culture. In Chapter 2, we explore the concept of culture more deeply, but here it is important to know that when anthropologists use the term culture, they are nearly always referring to ideas about the world and ways of interacting in society or in environment in predictable and expected ways. Cultural relativism. All humans participate in culture. Anthropologists, of course, also carry with them basic assumptions about how the world works and what is right or wrong, which typically become apparent when one is studying a culture that makes completely different assumptions. One possible response to the gap in understanding that comes with being in another culture is ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism. Assuming our way of doing things is correct, while simply dismissing other people's assumptions as wrong or ignorant. Such a position would render the attempt to understand other cultures meaningless and can lead to bigotry and intolerance. To avoid such misunderstandings, anthropologists have traditionally emphasized cultural relativism, the moral and intellectual principles that one should withhold judgment about seemingly strange or exotic beliefs and practices. Human diversity. Another of anthropology's major contributions to knowledge has been to describe and explain human diversity. The sheer variety of ways of being human around the world. When anthropologists talk about diversity, they mean something different from the popular usage of the term in the United States, which typically refers to different kinds of art, cuisine, dress, or dance, as well as to differences among various racial and ethnic groups. Early anthropologists of Taylor's day assumed that physical characteristics like skin tone, hair texture, stature or height, hair and eye color, and the shape of the nose, eyes, and lips were the defining characteristics of distinct races. Most of these early anthropologists assumed that race was closely associated with the sophistication of cultural development. Many believed that lighter skin tones were associated with more advanced peoples, while darker skin tones were associated with more limited mental abilities. These ideas were based on the notion that the several different races represented different species of human, each endowed with different mental and physical abilities and characteristics. In reality, the so-called races are not different species because people from these groups can intermarry and produce healthy and intelligent children who are themselves able to reproduce. Taylor and other early anthropologists also assumed that people from the lower races were incapable of developing sophisticated cultures with rich and refined traditions as Europeans had. We now know that people from any society can learn the cultural patterns of any other society. We also know that there are variations among different individuals in their apparent abilities. Such differences are not associated with so-called racial differences, but with individual ability and the families and communities in which they are raised. As we discuss in a larger chapter, the idea of race continues to exercise a powerful influence in the world, but it has no relevant bearing on intelligence or cultural sophistication. Differences of skin color and hair textures are merely aspects of human diversity that exist in the world. Defined anthropologically, diverse refers to multiplicity and variety, which is not the same as mere difference. Within multiplicity and variety, there is both difference and similarity. This idea of diversity as multiplicity can shed light not just on racial differences, but on another important issue of our time, the cultural effects of globalization, which refer to the rapid movement of money, people, and goods across national boundaries. People now drink Coca-Cola, wear Levi's jeans, and watch CNN all over the world, leading many observers to believe that the diversity of human culture is in decline because more and more people are participating in a global economy. Yet cultural differences do not just disappear. In fact, globalization creates many new opportunities for cultural diversity, differences, and similarities to thrive. An example drawn from the southern Mexican state of Chiapas illustrates this point. In Chiapas, some indigenous people have adapted Coca-Cola for use in their religious and community ceremonies. For many generations, TZTOTZIL Mayas, or Tzotzil Mayas, in the community of San Juan Chamula, used alcoholic drinks, particularly fermented corn drinks and distilled sugarcane liquor, in their public and religious rites. To create these rites, traditional Mayan religious leaders blended Catholic and indigenous traditions, combining Catholicism's celebration of Saints' Day with the Maya belief that consuming intoxicating spirits helps individuals access sacred powers. Alcoholism, however, became a severe problem, and beginning in the 1940s, many Maya began converting to Protestant sects that ban alcohol, eroding the power of traditional religious leaders. In the 1980s, these leaders began substituting Coca-Cola for alcoholic drinks and ceremonies. let's see here. Converting to Protestant sects that ban alcohol, eroding the power of traditional religious leaders. In the 1980s, these leaders began substituting Coca-Cola for alcoholic drinks in ceremonies. Some leaders gained great personal wealth as distributors of Coca-Cola, deepening socioeconomic class divisions in the community. But community members incorporated Coke into their ritual lives easily, accepting the notion that the soft drink's bubbles had powers once associated with alcohol. For example, the ability to help individuals belch out bad spirits residing in their bodies. Here's a powerful example of diversity as multiplicity. Change. As the previous example about globalization and Coca-Cola demonstrates, our world is dynamic and constantly changing. Anthropologists in each subfield are specialists in studying human change. For example, in cultural anthropology, researchers study topics as diverse as how and why religious change happens, what happens when a dominant economic system like socialism collapses or a new one like capitalism is incorporated into the traditional economy, and how and why political violence can erupt in societies experiencing rapid social change. In archaeology, researchers study the effects of environmental change on past societies, how changes in material culture reflect ongoing social, economic, and political changes, and the processes through which complex state societies were formed and disintegrated. In biological anthropology, researchers study the specific processes of human evolution and how our bodies and genetic makeup change in relation to environmental changes, migration, disease, and other dynamics. In linguistic anthropology, researchers study how new languages are formed when different languages come together, and how social changes, such as changes in gender relations, are reflected in and emerge from how people communicate with each other. Some of these changes, particularly changes in cultural practices, such as the consumption of Coca-Cola, can emerge over a few years or a generation or two. Others, like changes in human biology, can take many generations and are imperceptible to most living observers. Americans, for example, have gotten considerably taller than we were in colonial times 250 years ago, probably because of changes in diet, especially in the first few years of life. But this fact is largely unnoticed by modern Americans unless we tour fine colonial houses from the 1700s. When we notice that the doors are not nearly as tall as the standard door of today. Excuse me. Anthropology also mirrors the changing world in which it is practiced. As new topics, issues, and problems emerge, anthropologists study things they would not have studied several decades before. Today, for example, archaeologists may study garbage dumps and how high technologies are made in contemporary Silicon Valley computer factories to understand what people actually consume and throw away. Cultural and linguistic anthropologists explore how people create communities and identities and produce new forms of communication in cyberspace. Biological anthropologists specializing in primate behaviors design studies to aid wildlife conservation. However, moreover, the face of anthropology has changed dramatically in recent decades. Once a discipline dominated by white European and American men, anthropology is increasingly practiced by women and members of many ethnic and racial minority groups. In the United States today, in fact, women constitute the majority of professional anthropologists. Around the world, decolonization of former colonies, has brought once excluded indigenous peoples and members of internal minority groups into universities where many studied anthropology, further expanding the kinds of backgrounds and perspectives represented in the global discipline. Holism, and bringing together the study of human biology, prehistory, language, and social life under one disciplinary roof, anthropology offers powerful conceptual tools for understanding the entire context of human experience. The effort to synthesize these distinct approaches and findings into a single comprehensive explanation is called holism. It is American anthropology that has strived to be the most holistic. This was a legacy of German-born Franz Boas, later known as the founder of American anthropology through his work in the American Anthropological Association and at Columbia University in the early 20th century. His student Alfred Kroeber once described four-field anthropology as a sacred bundle. In the discipline's early years, it was possible for individuals like Boas and Kroeber and some of their students to work in all four subfields because the body of anthropological knowledge was so small. But within several decades, the expansion of the discipline and increasing specialization within its branches forced anthropologists to concentrate on a single subfield and topic within subfields, a continuing trend today. In the face of specialization and calls to unwrap the sacred bundle, that is, have the subfields go their separate ways, anthropology has struggled to retain its holistic focus. And many anthropologists are deeply dedicated to holism, citing its ability to explain complex issues that no single subfield, much less any other social science, could explain as effectively. In doing fieldwork, conducting holistic research with Stanley Ulijaszek, we highlight how one anthropologist conducts research in a holistic fashion. As the professor's research demonstrates, no single subfield by itself could address complex research problems. Working together, however, the subfields draw a compelling holistic picture of a complex situation. So how do anthropologists actually come to know such things? We turn to this issue in the next section. And I think that's a good place to stop. We're going to continue on later. Thanks for listening. Starting a new book, and we have a lot of professors' names and a lot of people I don't know yet, which it's tricky for me, but this is all very, very fascinating. So, see you next time.